Good morning. Welcome to the Prescribed Fire for Forest Management webinar series. On behalf of the welcome on behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, where we explore prescribed fire for forest management. Before we begin today, we want to acknowledge the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. My name is Steve Miller, and in my day job, I serve the U.S. Forest Service as the Regional Director for Fire and Aviation Management for the Eastern Region, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. A little bit about me. My father used to tell everybody that I knew I wanted to be a forester when I was in the 3rd grade, which for me is 54 years ago. I earned my Bachelor's of Science in Forest Administration from UWSP, so this is sort of a homecoming. That was almost 40 years ago. Since then, I've been managing land across the Southeast, now in the Northeast and Midwest, and sort of my focus, or my Zen space, if you will, is focusing on the ecological management of fire and on ecosystems. And so that's been my focus and continues to be my focus. Our invited speakers will explore several facets of forests and forest management. They've been invited to provide their perspectives and offer advice on how we can advance prescribed fire as a forest management tool in the future. We don't expect the speakers or anyone to have all the definitive answers about what the future will look like. Rather, we hope the series is going to provide insight, pose questions, and stimulate our collective thinking. Today, the focus is going to be on fire and traditional ecological knowledge beyond the lake states, which for me it's a real honor and a privilege. I was first introduced to the concept of indigenous use of fire by Henry Lewis, who was an anthropologist who spent his career working with tribes to understand tribal ecological knowledge. So this is a special opportunity for me. Now, before I introduce our guests, we have some housekeeping details to work on. So the session recordings and additional resources and evaluation links and information about continuing education will all be available through that portal where we registered. To receive continuing education, you need to be registered through UWSP, and you need to complete the Microsoft form provided to you during the session. The link is going to be posted periodically throughout today in the chat feature. If you're watching the recorded session, you would need to record your attendance using a different tool. There will be at the end an opportunity to do the session evaluation. I think that's it for that. Hang on, I'm managing 2 screens. So also in housekeeping, help us to keep this opportunity free. Don't share the portal Zoom link or Zoom recordings to someone who hasn't registered, because it's really important that we know how broad the contact area is. That helps secure funding and to continue to offer these opportunities as free educational opportunities. The series is hosted by the Wisconsin Forestry Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Department of Forestry. And again, there will be the evaluation link at the end. So your microphones and cameras have been disabled, but we want to hear from you. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function. So down there, just a little left of center, you see the Q&A. And so that is where you have the opportunity to ask questions as we go through. The chat feature may not be monitored, but our technical host is monitoring it for content. So the questions won't go in there. Questions will go in the Q&A. And before we begin, sort of say hello, good morning, whatever you prefer, and let us know where you're joining us from. As of today, it looks like we have 103 people on today's call, and through the series, we've had over 1,000 people participate from around the world. So welcome. Oops. And then we want to, last but not least, we sincerely appreciate the sponsors who make this opportunity to be free for all of us. The platinum sponsor being the Wild Turkey Federation. And so now I'm going to introduce our speakers for the day. And what we're going to do is Serra's going to go, Dr. Serra Hoagland from the Laguna people of the Pueblo, serves as a tribal relations specialist for the USDA Rocky Mountain Research Station of the Forest Service. She focuses on building partnerships with tribes and intertribal organizations and mentoring students in natural resources. Such a calling. That's a great calling. And conducting research that is relevant to Native communities. In 2020, Dr. Hoagland was selected as the most promising scientist by the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. Over the years, she has been actively involved in the Society of American Foresters, the Intertribal Timber Council, and the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, as well as the Wildlife Society. And the way we're going to run things today is Dr. Hoagland will make her presentation. We'll take some time for a few questions. And then our second speaker will come up and he will share his story, and then we'll have a little time for questions. And then whatever time we have left, we'll save for bigger questions, but we want to make sure that you have opportunities to ask each of them questions. Dr. Hoagland, you may take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction. I'm assuming you all can see my slide up on the screen and I'm coming through on the audio. If that's not the case, Steve, feel free to interrupt me. So thank you again for everyone for being here today. I'm calling in from Helena, Montana, where it's bright and early, and I know it's also early for those of you on the East Coast, West Coast, so thank you again for your time and your attention here. I also want to say a special thank you to Susan and to Steve for helping coordinate this, and the Wisconsin Forestry Center for sponsoring, as well as Wisconsin DNR. But most importantly, I want to thank my co-presenter, Vern Northrup, who's here on the screen as well. Vern will present after me, and when I was approached about this topic and presenting to you all, I just thought it would be really natural and really important to have Vern's voice in the room. And when you hear him speak, you'll understand why. Vern and I were fortunate enough to work on a book project together recently. He was one of our contributors for our new volume on tribal wildlife stewardship. And he brought in a piece that talked about fire and the importance of fire to Native communities and also wildlife habitat, and sort of our language and our tradition. So I'm just really honored to share the space with Vern, and thank you again, Vern. So with that, yeah, I'll just launch into my talk. There is a slight update in my bio, just as FYI, I'm no longer with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. I'm now serving as the National Program Lead for Tribal Research for the USDA Forest Service Research and Development Branch. So slightly new title on the screen there. That's just a new announcement. Really excited to take on this new role. So with that, let me make sure my slides will advance. Okay, so I've got sort of 4 sections in my talk today, starting with a introduction, sort of a little bit of my positionality and where I'm starting from, talk about IFMAT4, and I'll explain what that acronym means, but it's basically the nation's best assessment on tribal forests and fire today. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in the U.S. Forest Service with our tribal engagement projects. And then kind of end on a piece on what I've had the opportunity recently to serve as a tribal liaison on wildland fire incidents. So that's kind of a smorgasbord of stuff. And then I'll weave in some TEK throughout this. And I'll just do a special note. This little image here on the screen is actually from a First Nations community up in Canada. And I just really appreciated how they included some of the native language, as well as the seasons and the different species that are important to their community. And so this is sort of like my grounding piece as we move forward. So I like to start off with this quote. It is "The people who belong to the mountain." And this quote comes from my favorite book. It's entitled Ceremony. It's written by Leslie Mormon Silko, who's from my same tribe, the Pueblo of Laguna in New Mexico. And I'll just describe this scene that she's writing about in her fictional book. And so in the book, she's writing about a scene where elders in the community are kind of poking fun at how much time and energy and effort folks are spending into defining things like property ownership and boundaries and title and things like that. And the elders are just kind of back there chuckling, thinking, you know, it's we belong to these places. It's not that we ever like own them or have dominion over them. It's that we belong to these places. And I think that just quote in and of itself gives a nice description of sort of how natives view, and a lot of indigenous people view, their relationship to place, as far as stewarding these locations. And the mountain she's referring to in this book is Mount Taylor, which is a really sacred space for a lot of Pueblo tribes, not just my tribe, but tribes throughout the Southwest. So as far as taking care of these places and being intimately linked to the ecological processes, I really think that quote does a nice job of describing that. And that's me on some of my hunts back at Laguna. Another thing I'll use to sort of introduce myself is that I went to college from about 2003 to 2016. And in that time frame, I think even the concept of, or like the general understanding of traditional knowledge was like formulating within academia. And I'll admit, I kind of think that we had a little bit of this TEK dark ages here. So I'll describe this paper that Aldo Leopold wrote. And in my Western education, you know, Aldo Leopold was sort of seen as the father of conservation and someone who, you know, wrote, you know, we all had to read Sand County Almanac. We all had to, you know, look up to Aldo Leopold as, you know, someone who kind of like built the field of wildlife management. But I really think that Aldo Leopold had some pretty, kind of went through a cycle as far as like his understanding of ecological processes. But in this paper in 1920 that he wrote about Paiute forestry versus forest fire prevention, again in 1920, I think is really important to set the scene here for this talk and for folks to learn more about, because it wasn't always so great. In his paper, he describes, and this was a paper in 1920 in the Southwestern magazine, which was intended for miners and loggers. But the way he describes this, he says, the theory is called Paiute forestry for the alleged reason that California Indians deliberately light burn the forests in order to protect them against serious fires. But later in his paper, he says, it is of course absurd to assume that the Indians fired the forest with any idea of forest conservation in mind. And so as someone like reading that, and I didn't get exposed to this until I was into my PhD, you know, it just was really confusing. And, you know, quite honestly, it was really, I guess, an effort for folks to convince the general public that putting out all fires was a good thing and that we shouldn't be doing what the natives were doing as far as managing the forests, using light burning. So it's quite ironic that 100 years later, we're now knocking on tribes' doors and asking for bringing back cultural fire, right? I mean, tribes kind of were doing this the whole time around. And in fact, they were prosecuted for doing that. It was illegal for tribes to practice those traditions. They were put in jail for those things. So it's just, I think, yeah, and it's clearly difficult for me to talk about. And I think it's an interesting time in our history, but we can't forget that really like these things happened, even by folks like Aldo Leopold. So I guess to end my introduction on a happy note, though, is I feel really fortunate in my career that I've now been able to mentor and supervise and sponsor up to 36 Native students in natural resources. And these are just two here on the screen. Every summer I try to hire Native students through various programs that we have. This is Chase Vern, he's Navajo, and Elisha Flores, who's Hoopa. They were working with me that summer down at Mescalero. And I just think that we have a really bright future ahead. We are now into the third, maybe fourth generation after the American Indian movement, where tribes have worked really hard to promote tribal self-determination and support Indian education, which has led to opportunities like this, where folks like Chase and Elisha are now becoming leaders in their own communities and beyond. And I think really tribal self-determination and autonomy, and I'm paraphrasing from a dear friend of mine, Gary Morishima, those two things are not able to be accomplished. Like, they're just a fallacy until we have people and Indian people in positions of leadership. So I just really feel like we're at a really important time in our history where tribes are beginning to lead out on some of this stuff, and we're seeing the benefits of Indigenous-led conservation. So that's a long-winded introduction, but now I'd like to talk a little bit about IFMAT and our fourth report that just came out and our main findings. So IFMAT stands for the Indian Forest Management Assessment Team, IFMAT. It comes from the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act. There's another acronym there that's called NFIRMA. NFIRMA was passed in 1990. It's very similar to what we have on the National Forest System as far as like our Resource Planning Act. And this is the nation's only assessment looking at tribal forestry. And as this legislation was beginning to be passed in the 90s, and note, I was only 5 at this time, but I have learned from people who were important in getting this passed, but it was noted that timber resources were tribes' most valuable renewable resource from an economic standpoint. There was also a National Indian Wildlife Resource Management Act trying to be pursued at the same time, but it didn't come to fruition. So we just have NFIRMA. And what NFIRMA requires is, it's required by Congress. It's a decadal independent assessment of tribal forests and forest management in the US. In the law, it has 8 mandated tasks that this independent team is supposed to address. And then pretty much every cycle, the Intertribal Timber Council puts in another 3 sort of urgent needs or, pressing topics for the independent team to study. So we had a total of 11 tasks. The ultimate goal is to provide this integrated picture of Indian forests today and forestry on trust lands. And so that's why, the title of our seminar today is Beyond the Lake States. Like, this is sort of our national view of what's going on. But we had an IFMAT report produced in 1993, 2003. In 2013, I was participating as a Native grad student observer on the report. And then in 2023, we published our 4th report, and I was one of the co-authors and the only Native author on the core team. We did have other Native technical specialists who contributed to the report this time, but we really hope for IFMAT 5, it's predominantly represented by Native authors. But for IFMAT 4, we visited a total of 37 tribes throughout the United States. We technically surveyed 42 tribes, but some tribes weren't, because this was happening during COVID, some tribes weren't willing to host us, which is totally fine. But we surveyed them anyways through webinars and things like that and meetings. Those 37 tribal forests have a nice geographic diversity as far as their representation, and then also special topics, the different categories of tribal forests that they represent, some being category 1, category 2, and then we had some category 4 tribes, and a variety of self-governance governance structures too. So some direct service tribes, some, fully compact and contracted tribes, and then we had tribes that were even applying to ITARA. So we had a nice suite, a great representation. We met with the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well, regional and central offices. We did a comparative analysis, and we did these tribal focus groups as well as a lot of different surveys. So we collected a lot of information over a almost 3-year period. And just to know, out of the 74 total recommendations that we've produced in IFMAT 1 through 3, a total of 65 have been addressed with some sort of action. And right now with IFMAT 4, we're in the implementation phase. So the recommendations that we put forward are being actively worked on through various avenues. All these IFMAT reports can be found online at the Intertribal Timber Council's webpage, which is listed there. And I'll briefly share some of our executive summary, overall findings, and then some of the findings related to fire, because I know that's why you all are on the call today. We really can't talk about fire in Indian country or even really TEK without recognizing that there are huge economic disparities in Indian country, and also within our tribal forestry and fire programs. So if you take away anything from this presentation, I want you all to understand this slide, that there are significant financial gaps in how tribes are actually funded to manage their forest resources. So this figure is showing you by decade. The colors in black show the actual funding that was provided to tribes, and the color in red is the amount that was actually recommended for tribes to manage their forests. So the blue is basically the gap per decade. So there's real significant gaps. In 2019, we broke it up by forestry and fuels funding as well as the wildfire funding. And so, what this generally kind of breaks down to, because again, I work for the Forest Service, but if we were to equate this to just like on the ground numbers, for every $3 the Forest Service gets to manage an acre, tribes only get $1. So it's really unfortunate and it's disheartening. And some of the conclusions here on this slide say state-of-the-art forestry cannot be achieved without that long-term programmatic funding. And then we've also noticed that tribes are actually buying land back, which is really exciting, the whole land back move. But it's, the little bit that they're given is being stretched by this growing land base. And what we've also noticed is that tribes are increasing their reliance on sort of soft funding or grant funding instead of that more long-term programmatic funding. So it creates real consequences in tribal forestry departments throughout the US. Just to touch on sort of our executive summary, because in the report, we produced a full volume, which is something like 200 plus pages, but then we also have a 12-page executive summary that's really helpful, and it covers all those 11 mandated tasks. And then we also have a 2-pager. So if folks go to ITC's webpage, you can download whichever version you want. But touching on the executive summary, this was our very most concrete conclusion from the report beyond the funding metrics that we put together. But what we saw is that there's a unique vision of forest management on tribal lands, including a focus on stewardship and non-timber forest products as self-governance is increasing. Remember, I talked about even my own personal history and kind of where we are today, I think, in terms of tribal governments. And so all this is good things, right? And tribes are focusing on non-timber forest products, but the Secretary's trust responsibility remains, and it's very vaguely defined. And I'll just leave that at that. We also noted that forest-based income is less important value, and tribes are really prioritizing more of these stewardship values and more of the traditional uses of their forest. And I just put a note in here about non-timber forest products because I think fire actually really relates to non-timber forest products management, since a lot of the times it's more of an understory species, and those are the species that can benefit from moderate use of fire. But there's a lot of threats that exist to non-timber forest products. Talking about just the general findings around wildfire hazard throughout Indian country today. there's a significant portion of forest tribal lands in the consolidated Pacific Northwest that ranked really high as far as wildfire hazard, and unfortunately was slightly worse than the U.S. Forest Service. But for other regions, the BIA lands typically fared better. So the wildfire hazard was actually lower on tribal lands. Lands in the hazard category had been increasing since 2010. And all of this was using the land fire data and using staff and colleagues from Oregon State University and the fire lab with the Forest Service. But tribes were really concerned about the wildfire risk. But again, it's limited by the funding levels and their ability to hire and retain enough staff to treat more acres. So these are just two graphs and figures that I pulled from the IFMAT4 report. And this is the we call it task B, which it looks at the status and the condition of tribal forests, which is where you'll find some of this data on fire in the report. But this just shows the amount of acres burned on trust lands from 2010 to 2020, as well as the hazard fuels accomplishments, and then the funding, including RTRL from 2003 to 2020. So data like this and figures can be found in the report. And then I think Susan also and Steve let me know that these slides will be available online. So you all can look at this later if you'd like. So now that I've talked about IFMA, I'd like to jump into what we're doing in the Forest Service with research and development and some of the tribal projects we're working on. A couple things. One, we have our research and development tribal engagement roadmap, which is a document that was actually produced a little while ago, and it's slightly dated now, but it provides various objectives and strategies with how within research and development we'd like to work with tribal entities on various research projects and with tribal colleges and universities. So that resource I think is a really great place to look at what we're doing. And then more recently in 2011, we had that White House ITEK memo that came through, and we have the correlating federal guidance that we are using in our research. We have goals of creating something more specific to our federal agency. And in fact, in the White House memo, it does recommend each agency come up with their own sort of customized guidance. And at this point, we in the Forest Service in R&D really have pretty limited bandwidth as well. In fact, it's kind of just myself and 3 other colleagues that are tasked with this. So we're trying to make headway, but at this point, we have not made our own customized plan. We do have tribal relations specialists with all of our research stations that were recently hired in the last 2 to 3 years. For those of you in the Northern Research Station, that is Jennifer Bollinger, who's your representative. And then we have Aurora Lear in the Pacific Northwest and the Pacific Southwest, and then Michelle Bonfleck in the Southern Research Station. So we have tried to hire staff within our stations to help move out on some of this work. These next 2 bullet points are actually projects that were funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law funding that came out. One, we're looking at models of tribal co-stewardship and examples of research partnerships where we can learn some lessons and identify some maybe barriers and challenges that these research projects experienced. But all of this with a goal and an eye to looking at tribal co-stewardship of federal lands and waters. The second one that we got funded is, we're calling it a secondary analysis of tribal research needs. Back in, I think it was about 2018, we distributed a survey to tribal foresters and natural resource managers asking for their top research priorities and their interest in participating in research, as well as how they access primary literature. And we produced a Journal of Forestry article summarizing all that survey data. So I can put that link in the chat here in a second. But We weren't able to do a deep dive into the fire related topics, and there's a lot of really good, great information in that survey data. So we're going to look back through that and sort of tease out some themes and hopefully identify some of these research priorities that were provided by tribes. Another thing that I've just been working on for the past 14 years is looking at the effects of forest treatments on the spotted owl in south central New Mexico. The spotted owl's biggest threat is fire, so we're working really hard to understand how the owl will respond to various fuel reduction treatments as well as forest thinning projects. And then lastly, in the Forest Service, we provide research scholarships to Native students, as well as we run a program called NARA. It's the Native American Research Assistantship Program. So we're trying to do a lot of this work. You know, just speaking frankly about this topic, I'm the only enrolled tribal member who works for research and development and actively does research. Jen Bollinger is her and myself are not RGEG scientists, but we do not have a lot of tribal representation in research and development. So I think part of the story here too is about Native recruitment and retention within research and development, not just within our agency, but at other research institutions to help move forward on some of this work, as well as build allies, which what we're doing today. Okay, my last little section I'd like to talk about, and then I'm definitely going to hand the torch over to Vern. But I'd like to touch a little bit on wildfire incidents and incorporating tribal liaisons, because I thought that might be a nice piece to include here in this talk, and it might just be of interest to folks. So this photo on the screen is actually from when I served on the Dixie Fire in Northern California. And this photo was taken actually on Indigenous Peoples Day, which in some states is still recognized as Columbus Day. But they're up there on the stage during the morning briefing is the fire chief from the Greenville Indian Rancheria, and his name is Danny Manning, and he addressed all the fire camp that day, and then all of our spike camps that we had. And it was a really monumental day with it being Indigenous Peoples Day. And at that time in the fire, it was more fire, I guess, suppression repair work that was going on. But the Greenville Indian Rancheria tribe lost their entire engine bay. They lost their entire tribal office. A lot of their tribal members lost their homes in this fire. Yet we had folks like Danny and their fire crew out there continuing to work on this fire. And I think it just put a really important but somber point in the fire camp about, you know, a lot of these resources are sacred to tribal communities, and you know, we should be doing as much work as possible to mitigate the impacts from these fires on especially on Indigenous peoples. So just fire in 2024, fire management research and stewardship practices today can be greatly improved by incorporating ancient traditions and practices from Native communities who've inhabited these places for millennia. And we have to start working alongside our tribal communities when co-producing and integrating knowledge to achieve desired outcomes related to fire. So some of the duties that were assigned to me as a tribal liaison on these fire assignments, and I've served in several now and hope to go out this next season too, but mainly serving and working closely with the agency administrators and coordinating with them, as well as other representatives from land management agencies, serving as the lead contact and coordination between our incident command team and the Bureau of Indian Affairs if they are not present there. And also serving as the tribal relations sort of point of contact, and just serving as that coordination and communication with tribes and the tribal organizations within the footprint of the fire. And then lastly, providing some assistance with consultation and recommendations between the agency administrator and then tribal governments and organizations. And just a special note that, you know, when we say tribes, there's a lot of different categories that might be assumed. And I probably should have clarified this or had this earlier on just to define our language, but there's different categories, right? So, within some of these fire incidents, we did have, I think, gosh, on the Dixie, something like 11 federally recognized tribes, but then we also had state recognized tribes that were interested and had areas of interest that were burned in the fire. But we also had intertribal organizations, that had kind of special care in some of these sites, so we had to work with them. And then you also have individual tribal members and folks who are practitioners too. So just to recognize that there's a variation, but as far as like the federal trust responsibility and the sovereign right holders, really that just falls with the federally recognized tribes, and there are 574 today. I always put the plus there because there are currently tribes actively seeking their federal recognition, so that number can change through time. Just some of our priority work, and again, this was just my experience serving as a tribal liaison on these incidents, but trying to identify emerging issues and culturally significant areas that were in need of suppression repair. Again, trying to educate the agency administrator and incident command teams about our federal trust responsibility and what that really means on the ground. And then just serve as a liaison between all the groups. I did a lot of trying to submit resource orders for tribal specialists, folks who were helping, serve as cultural monitors in places that were really significant to the tribes. Also hosting field visits and executive briefings for the tribal council, and just maintaining that sort of list of tribal contacts. Just as sort of like a positive thing here, I think we have a lot of opportunities to work together and manage these complex needs under urgent timeframes, given these limited resources. And I really do think that in the period we've had tribal liaisons on some of these large incidents, we really increased the understanding of trust responsibility and what that meant. We increased the representation and had decision making by the tribal community and the tribal governments. And then, structurally, it led to some of these larger scale agreements and MOUs to promote sort of that regular dialogue, right, between the federal agency and the tribal leaders. So I thought that was a real positive thing. And I think this is one of my last slides. So Vern, get ready, get on the queue. But just some lessons learned. One thing that we'd really like to continue to advocate for is supporting tribal fire departments in the off season, and allowing their members to get red cards. In California with the crew, they're doing some real innovative things now, where they're kind of changing the standards, which is a good thing. But there's the whole thing around maybe a purple card, but also just making sure that we're all staffed up and ready to go before fire season comes. Fire, as you all know, is all about communication. And so just having that real good established communication, I think, was a real positive thing for us. And then, promoting flexibility and submitting these resource orders for tribal crews to actually do that on-site monitoring, I think was really helpful. So with that, I covered a lot of content. I might have gone over, I'm sorry, Vern, but I would just love to say Da'o'e. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I hope you all now have a better understanding of like the general picture of tribal forestry today from our IFMAT report, and you have a sense of what we're doing in the Forest Service, and you all have learned a little bit about tribal liaisons serving on these incidents. So with that, I'm just so pleased to hand it over to Vern, and maybe Steve is going to do a quick introduction for him, and I will stop sharing my screen. So thank you.
So Dr. Hoagland, before we switch there, we do have a couple of questions. So
Yeah,
we'll do a
right,
couple of questions, and then
Yes.
it'll be my honor to introduce Vern. Question coming in from the group on
Okay.
recruitment of tribal students. Could you
Yes.
say more about what is the source of the gap? Is it educational discrepancies,
Mm,
deficits at early stage, a lack of interest, or is part of the problem a suspicion on the part of young people or their elder advisors about what the party lines might be taught in Western research and science
yeah.
context?
Oh, those are great. And those are all, yes, very viable um, reasons for why there is a gap. I think another one too is yeah, sometimes there's a clash between Western education and what Native students are taught, as far as, especially as it comes down to like science curriculum. So there is some research that has shown where Native students outperform their counterparts in fields of science and math up until about the seventh grade, but then there becomes like this divergence after that. And so I even think, thinking younger and younger and trying to work with Indian education and students even at that lower age range to even promote and say that yes, this field of forestry or wildlife or fire is a great career outlet, and making sure that we can maintain those students through junior high and then into high school so they can continue to excel in science and math. Not that it's required to, be a forester or firefighter, but I think that's kind of where we see some of that divergence, and there is some data related to that. And then, yeah, I think it's simply a lag effect. I mean, so I spent 5 years working at Salish Kootenai College in the forestry department there. And, nationwide, we had, I don't know, maybe 80 students at one point in time. So it's a minority within a minority within a minority. Like, it's just such a small subset of individuals. But one organization, and that was one slide I had at the end as an additional resource, but I didn't include it, is the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. That's the nation's top organization to promote natives in STEM. And so I think ACES is a great place to address some of this work and then partner with as well to recruit and retain native students. Thank you for that question.
So one more question, and this one's mine.
Okay.
I have the opportunity to read a lot of Forest Service documents in my current job, and looking at the wildfire crisis strategy and
Yes.
looking at the National Prescribed Fire Review, there is a lot of emphasis written in there that we should learn about tribal ecological knowledge and and expand its influence over how we respond with fire.
Yes.
What are your reflections on the appearance of that language, and are we actually walking the walk?
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. That's a good question. In some places, I think we are. There are some great examples out there, but we are learning and we're an agency that's slow to adapt. And it's also a very complex thing, right? Like we're asking, yeah, I mean, including ITEK in our decision making is such a huge paradigm shift for our agency. And so it's not going to happen overnight. And if it did, that could also put tribes at risk, right? So there's this like TEK rush happening. So we really have to find this delicate balance. And some of these are urgent needs too. So it's um, quite a complex issue for us to work on. But what we have started with is including indigenous knowledge and native science, native knowledge in our best available scientific information and our Forest Service directive and handbook and manual. And those, even just like adding that language, I think is a first start. I mean, that just makes sure that it's in our guidance documents. And then from there, moving out, I think it's going to take a lot of these relationships and local champions to make it work on the ground. And so, yeah, Steve, I think sometimes I feel the same way too. Like we're saying all these things and we're doing it, but like, where's the on the ground tangible benefit yet? And I think it's a matter of time for us to develop some of that, but we need to move in that direction. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
We got one more question, then I'm going to switch over. This
Great.
came in from the listeners, and you've impressed someone to ask that they want to learn more about this. They are looking forward into digging into some of the resources you mentioned to learn
Great.
about tribal ecological research that you published. Do you have any TEK, forest management and stewardship clearinghouse or databases or collected resources that you could suggest so that they can strive to learn more?
Oh, I love this. Thank you so much. I'll mention a couple things. So yeah, the Intertribal Timber Council's webpage for IFMAT, that's helpful. There's not, I mean, there's some TEK in there, especially as it relates to non-timber forest products, because we did survey tribes about that. So depending on what region you look into, you can actually go to the appendix and you can look at some of those non-timber forest products. We try to be really delicate with not like identifying, specific examples, because that can get kind of sensitive. But if you just want to think regionally, that's a great resource. Another resource is that book that Vern is also featured in. We just put together and published it last year. It's Wildlife Stewardship on Tribal Lands. It's published by Johns Hopkins University Press, and it's over 100 native and non-native authors and a lot of really good shareable TEK that's included in that contributed volume. So that's an excellent contemporary resource. I'll admit I didn't even have that resource while I was in school, so we're just really pleased to have that out. But then another note too about just TEK in general, that we just need to be cognizant of. Tribal data is proprietary, and with the Forest Service, it is protected against FOIA. And so if you are really interested in like honing in on a particular project or a species or things like that, you really got to work with the tribal government, first of all, to even be collecting that data and then to be storing and housing it. So no, we do not have a TEK clearinghouse data set, not at all. And the federal government shouldn't have that. The tribes themselves should be owning that data and being able to manage and store it themselves. So go to those specific tribal governments and work on specific agreements if you're interested in pursuing a project on TEK. That was a long-winded answer, Steve, but hopefully that covers it all. But I'm glad I elicited some inspiration to people to look up more information. That's great.
Thanks, Sarah. And if we have time at the end, we'll have more questions. But right now,
Great.
it is an honor and a privilege to introduce Vern Northrup. He spent 24 years as a fire operations specialist and a burn boss for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, working on wildfires across the West and working on fires close to home in Minnesota. Vern is a Fond du Lac band of Lake Superior Chippewa elder and a visual storyteller. His photographs and teachings offer the Anishinaabe perspectives of the place of humans in the world, the seasons, and more. He uses photography as a tool to educate both himself and the viewer about the rhythms of nature and the preservation of tradition and the relationship between resilience and sustainability. And so, Vern, it is an honor and a privilege to have you present to us your observations and perspective.
Miigwech, thank you, Steve. Buju, Indinawe Magarinjo, Ani Nikinawea, Bungi yet to go in any time on a Shinabe Moen. Wase Aniquid Nijindakaz, Makwood and Dodum, Nagachi Wana Nindunjaba, Guava Agarin Nadinda. Hello, my name is, my English name is Vern Northrup. I'm a, like you said, a Fond du Lac elder. I'm a retired wildland firefighter operations specialist. I work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And like one friend reminded me, I have the luxury of walking in both worlds. I walked in the traditional ecological knowledge and with the scientific knowledge that the fire world gave me. And blending the two has been very, very interesting to me through my career and through my my observations here later in life after I retired and on how we can change things. Right now, our forests are very sick. And it's up to us as the Anishinaabe people, being the land stewards on our land, to help heal it, And the way we can do that is through fire. And traditional use of fire has gone on for thousands and thousands of years across the entire globe. And Anishinaabe use fire traditionally for many, many different reasons, for food gathering, for pest control, for just so you had the ability to see through the forest, so you could see your game, your prey, the animals you're hunting, and also the fire. When we use the fire, it also spurts that new growth, which is beneficial to a lot of the spirits out there that that inhabit that world. The new growth of that particular plant and its either food qualities or, excuse me, medicinal qualities. And everything out here that we view in, our view here on Fond du Lac, or the Anishinaabe people, is everything out here is either food or medicine to us, or both. And we think of it, our surroundings, except for the inanimate things like our car or a house or anything like that, it all has a spirit. And the spirit of fire is one of the oldest spirits on earth. And we always humble ourselves to the spirit world, because they have so much more knowledge than we have. The fire's ability to cleanse and to clean and to renew, also to destroy. But we look at it with its healing aspect, for its the things that it provided us, the warmth, the warm food, the all our surroundings, everything that was out there that was food to us, that it brought to us. So we honored and humbled ourselves to that spirit when we used it, and to keep it in that thought, we always had to make sure that we brought along a gift for it when we were using it. When we asked its permission to use it, we brought it.
Vern, you went on mute, sir. Vern, you went on. Now you're off mute. Okay.
Oh, I wonder where I went. Well, anyway, what I was talking about, what was the last thing I was saying there, Steve?
I'm sorry, I got focused on trying to get you unmuted. You were only bringing a gift.
Yeah, bringing the gift to fire.
Yeah, the gift of fire. It is such a gift to us. It's provided all we needed in this land we call, what we call Nagachuanang, which to us was a paradise. It had absolutely everything we needed. Absolutely everything we needed: the food, the water, the medicine, everything. And it provided. And we found out over time that if we managed our surroundings with fire, that spirit will provide more to us, more. And we found that we had to honor it and humble ourselves before those spirits, because they have their own lives, they have their own, what would you call it, purpose in this world. And for them to come back and to help us was such a healing thing. But getting back to cultural fire, there's so many uses out there that we can't count all the uses that people around the world use fire for. And a lot of it was just for food production, for to give us more food, to give us the foods that we needed to heal us. But also the fire healed the ground itself. So you know, that's how we looked at fire. And that's how we always look at fire. You know, it's not a bad thing. You know, I've had one elder when I started my career, and I was talking to him about my job, my current job, and he was going, "Yeah, I'm glad for you, Vern. You got a good job, you're making good money. But remember one thing, not all fire is bad." And for that, you know, and me being an elder now, I can still picture that conversation in my mind with that elder. In fact, he's still alive. He's in his 90s. But he talked of a time when they would burn large tracts of the swamp around the rice lakes for different reasons. And one of the reasons that was mentioned was when there was a lot of bugs in the rice, a lot of called rice worms, and they eat the rice too. But what they do is they would burn along the shores of the rice lakes. So that's where that particular bug was coming from. That's where it overwinter on the shores, because it couldn't winter on the ice, you know, in the lake, but it winter on the shores. It's actually a moth, and they burn around there, and they say, well, you burn it every few years, you'll have good rice after that. And then going back into, you know, another one is the blueberries. The blueberries would burn on a 5-year cycle. First year you got good blueberries. Second year, well, first year you just have the plants. Second year you starting to get blueberries. Third year they're really good. Fourth year they're starting to decline. So then you hit them with fire again. But they found they could do that on different plots. So every year they would have good blueberries in one of those plots. So it was the sustainable use of fire like that was just amazing to me when I started working in fire. You know, I started learning about it, and then I started learning my personal history. And my personal history goes back to my grandfather, and he was appointed by the government to be a fire warden on this reservation during the heyday of logging. During the heyday of logging, we had a lot of fires around Minnesota and the upper Great Lakes because of the slash that was generated with these logging operations. So a fire warden, what his job was to do was to take care of a particular geographical area, and to go out there and make sure when these loggers, after they're done cutting, they would cut their slash up and, you know, scatter it so it wasn't, you know, creating such big piles and stuff. But he was also in fire suppression too. So, and some of the tools that they had is I don't think he had his own horse, but they would furnish a horse, a wagon, and tools for 20 men, and that was his cash. And that was an interesting time. It was interesting that when I learned about that, and it was not too long ago, that was his job. And then he was in the National Guard at the time of the 1918 fire in Cloquet that burned a couple 100,000 acres in an afternoon. But his unit was activated, and they were fighting fire in a suburb of Duluth. The fire burned literally up to the lake from Moose Lake, so it burned quite a ways. And he was fighting fire around Hermantown there. That was pretty exciting to learn that part of my history. I started in fire in late '86 or so as a volunteer for a township fire department here. We had a tragedy that happened to one of our relatives, and so when we had no fire departments here on the reservations, there were just township and counties, and you know, so some of us Anishinaabe asked to join the local department, and we were welcomed in there. We started training with them, working with them, going on fires. The next year, the DNR, Minnesota DNR, asked if I wanted to be a smoke chaser during the fire seasons, and I said, sure. You know, it was money. There was not many jobs here in res, so I went to started working with them, fighting fires around Cloquet and around Carlton County and in the state too. So then I did that for a couple of years. Then during the summer, I would go with the Forest Service and get on a hand crew and go out west somewhere. I did that till 1990. Then the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in its wisdom, they decided that they needed firefighters on each reservation. So they'd have a squad of firefighters on each reservation. And then when a bigger fire would come, we'd come together as a hand crew and we'd be fight fire. But also at the time we were recognizing that there was a need for more prescribed fire here. And we couldn't just go start doing it as, you know, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We had to work through the individual tribes' land we were on. So we approached the tribal government here about doing some prescribed fire around the reservation and their needs. You know, what do you want us to do? You know, what can we serve you with? You know, for? And we the council thought that was pretty good. It was great, and he said, but you can't do it today. And he said you have 1 year to educate the reservation on what you're planning to do. So that entailed, you know, some door knocking and some visits, some public meetings and things like that. And we got our permission. But with the stipulation, the chairman said, don't burn down the reservation. So we're going to take your matches away from you. So yeah, we didn't. We did some prescribed fires around here. We just started, and we had, you know, short on experience, short on, you know, equipment. We were first initial attacking out of sedans. Yeah, we didn't have much, but we had to make a go of it, and we'd do some burning. Then later on, as we're getting, you know, get more equipment, we get more experience, get more training. My boss, the FMO, said, well, we're going to put a burn module together. And so what he did was he identified 2 of us as burn bosses. You know, we got our training, we got signed off. And he said, what you're going to do is you 2 burn bosses are going to have an engine from each reservation. And you're going to go around to each reservation in the spring and do their prescribed fires. And then you're also an extra resource during the spring fire season. So if a bigger fire pops up, we got a strike team of engines and firefighters. So we did that, and that was great fun. We'd go to all the reservations and go burn in different areas and, you know, see different landscapes. We were up in Grand Portage, up on the Rocky Mountain hillsides there, and fighting or burning for blueberries, and go down in Mille Lacs Reservation, and you're burning out swamps just because they're such a high hazard. When they burn hard. And yeah, it was great fun to go around the reservations and do that. And we built up a camaraderie between, you know, the reservations and the BIA's, you know, the fire program, which was really cool. And we were really welcome and well received at these reservations. Now, a lot of our, because the Bureau of Indian Affairs was so small, a lot of our folks that were full-time or, you know, partial, seasonal, they had to get a lot of training. And myself included, I had to go from firefighter 1 to burn boss, you know, and I had to get that and a crew bus, and I had to get aviation training. I was a helicopter manager, single engine air tanker manager, tanker base manager. So we all had to learn a lot real fast, and we had to wear many hats in that way. And that was a problem, because we had to make sure to keep people that were available, you know, for some of these jobs, you know. And then the younger ones, we could move up through the ranks, up through ignition and holding, you know, et cetera. But that was a good time for me. I really loved that time, because we were going around and helping so many people. And not only that, we were getting out to other reservations too, you know. In Florida, we get down there and get out west in the Southwest, get out to help them. And that was a great program. And they're still doing it now to a certain extent, but most of it's for suppression. I'd like to see it more, you know, geared towards prescribed fire on these reservations, you know, or a cultural fire. Now, when I think about, you know, how my life turned out, and how my interest in fire grew and stuff like that, I can only account for that because of our cultural closeness to the earth. You know, how close we are, our relationship to the earth out there, and everything out there is sacred to us. And makes me grateful that for the job I had, and we can carry on some of those traditions of cultural burning. It's very important to us, and we need more of it across this country. Not only that, but to also to help with the suppression, to make those mosaics in the forest, so we don't have that catastrophic 250,000 acre run in one day, you know. So that's about it. But anybody have any questions? I'd be more than happy to.
So yeah, Vern, we got a couple of questions. One came in from the group of, you mentioned about asking the spirit of fire for permission to use it and bringing it a gift. How does this work when you're on a suppression side of the situation? Do you ask about suppressing the fire, or how do you relate to the fire when your responsibility is to suppress it?
Well, we'll still have our, you know, it's still our beliefs in the fire is not going to change. It's suppression we have to, because we know it's, you know, it's could be dangerous. It could be, you know, could hurt some people like that. And then, you know, and I have no qualms about suppressing it like that. But I also let it know that, you know, we're doing this for a reason. We're out here for a reason, and we're protecting lives, you know. Did that help you any at all?
So it's interesting to me because your ancestors and mine were, my great grandfather was in the Home Guard and was up on those 1918 fires as well. And apparently back in those days, not very many people had cameras, so he brought back postcards of the effort that they had and what the area looked like with that fire. Uh, we got another question in from the listeners. Can you think of examples of fuel breaks that you've leveraged in cultural burning that may be different from the Western mindset of fuel breaks?
A lot of our fuel breaks around here are, you know, we connect them to lakes or rivers, or, you know, we connect the dots. And some of those, you know, they're not going to last forever, you know, unless you know, you maintain them. But a lot of them are, you know, you keep shifting your focus on where you're going to burn, and some of those breaks you aren't going to be back to for the next 10 years. And so things are going to change over that time, and they're going to succeed in. And it's But we don't, you know, we don't rely on, you know, permanent field breaks. You know, our wetlands and our lakes are kind of help us out there.
I am blessed to have been introduced to a young woman from the Creek tribe in Alabama. Her name's Sohoy Thrower, and she got into fire because her grandmother's a medicine person in their tribe. And her grandmother can identify 400 species of plants, but they can only find about 220 of them because the other 180 are fire dependent. So Sahoy is having to learn about how to get fire on the landscape before her grandmother is no longer available to her to share that verbal history of the medicine. So, um, and I understand much of fire knowledge is a verbal history and shared experience kind of thing. Are there steps being taken to in case fire management isn't moving fast enough that some of that information and experience isn't lost? What's being done to make sure that knowledge, wisdom, understanding isn't lost?
Well, I just do it on my own here on the reservation. I toot my own horn and I encourage them, hey, let's get out here, let's do some burning, you know, it's that time, you know, we just went through, you know, a drought last fall, and then we had a snowless winter. So I was kind of edgy on, you know, any prescribed fire this spring, but, wait till we get, you know, kind of it used to be our normal pattern was we'd get rain about every 5th day. And if you had 10 days without rain, you in the fire season, literally, you know, you were in the fire season again. So, you know, we always kind of banked on that, having a rain in the forecast. But I remember my grandfather when I was younger, he'd tell me, you know, go out, you know, to this wilderness area that we have is called the ditch banks. Go out there by Second Bridge, and he said, start that swamp on fire. He says, well, okay. We went out, we did it. Oh, about an hour and a half later, after the fire was started, DNR started showing up. Here's one guy in a truck with a pump can, and I'm like, oh, he's not going to do much, you know. But my grandfather knew that this fire would only burn to the edge of the woods. You know, he knew the seasons enough that it burned to the edge of the woods and it dropped down, and then you could, you know, put it out with a bladder bag or pump can. But yeah, that was always, you know, and someone else would say, hey, go burn over here. I want to, I want that wildlife open and stay clear. And one of the ones was, I remember once that my uncle's during this, after January, when food was getting harder and harder to come by, they'd still want to go get a deer, you know. But that time of the deer are in the swamps, or, you know, that's where it's warmer in there. So he'd go down and he'd cut down a couple cedar trees. And that's where the deer would gravitate to, because they like cedar during the winter. And then we could just stand on the edge and you could shoot the one you wanted, you know. But also to maintain that was, we'd go back in there a couple of years later and they'd burn that what was left of those trees that were burned down. So to kind of maintain that opening. So you always had an opening you could go sit by and something would come down there.
So another question came in from the group. You've mentioned that spring is pretty important for prescribed burns, but are cultural burns done typically in the spring, or are there other seasons that are
No,
used as well?
we do them throughout the year, you know, when we can. But spring was real good because then we're catching the green up, you know, and stuff. And then in the spring you're not gonna have it get away where it'll get to the edge of the woods, you know, and it'll drop down where you can take care of it. But yeah, we burn year round, or not year round, but you know, through the fall burns. So,
So another participant is sharing a story from their past of they aren't from a tribe, but they grew up in an area that used to tend to burn a lot. They remember having Smokey Bear come to their school the day after their family had just burned out the ditch. And they remember feeling kind of ashamed at what their family was doing because of Smokey Bear's message. And it took them a while to overcome it. So do you feel like that as far as kids with tribes?
Well, you have to be pretty precise on how you educate the kids because, there will be people that'll, use it wrong ways. And so you have to hit them with the points, the high points. Not all fire is bad, but the fire that we are using to make good fire, we have to control it and be in control. Yeah, that was the message I used to give to the kids.
I had the opportunity to lead a kayak trip of a group of indigenous fire practitioners who were meeting in Jacksonville, Florida 10 years ago or so. And they were sharing with me that there are many reasons for using fire amongst their tribes. And I think they listed it off: physical, social, and ecological. But all of those are sort of in a big ring of spiritual sort of responsibility to use fire. And you shared about how some of the land is sick. So as a tribal fire practitioner, describe for the rest of us how that sort of feels when you know you have a spiritual responsibility and it's not where you would want it to be spiritually.
Right. It's hard looking at some certain places in our forest where, it's so tangled up and overgrown, you can't get through there, and to me, it's like we let this go on too long, and that ground is sick. That forest is sick there, and we got to do something about. And spiritually, I would, I feel for it because I know that spirit is ailing, and there's the way that I can help it. But I have to come across more money, more resources, more, to do that. But I know that it's, that it is sick, and we do need to take care of that. Us being the stewards of this land, there's we're not going to get any more land. So, we have to take care of what we have. It's it's our responsibility.
The next question switches from the spiritual to the little more practical kinds of things. So prior to drip torches, what were the tools used to ignite burns?
Oh, there was old pine trees that were felled, and you'd cut off a limb and drag that limb through the woods, or birch bark with a rock in it and throw it into the swamp. And that was a favorite ignition for a lot of Anishinaabe around here. Just take that piece of birch bark and just go throw it somewhere. Whatever happens, happens, But they didn't think of it that way. They thought of, well, they know it's going to go out, And 9 times out of 10, the Minnesota DNR is going to show up looking to cite somebody. It never happened. They just melt into the woods, But the spiritual side of this burning is, to me, it's very important. It's we are, the fire is the medicine that it needs. And with that, we try to do everything responsibly and remind ourselves and the spirits that, we're trying to do a good thing here, trying to help heal, not only heal the land, but to heal ourselves. And, we might get some medicines out of it, but to heal ourselves, spiritually, it's to help that spirit. And that's, to me, important.
over the course of my career, I've had some really interesting aha moments. We had an endangered plant that they told me to be really careful, but it's fire dependent. So when we burned it a couple of times, suddenly instead of 6, we had 10,000. Um, as there's increased energy around tribal ecological knowledge and cultural fire on the landscape. Are you enjoying a lot of those kind of aha moments where somebody sees what you've been telling them and they go, "Oh,
Exactly.
that's what."
Exactly. I love that, especially if I go to talk to, a large group of uh people who have been in fire for a long time, and they've been set in their ways and what their, the objectives are. But then we'd show them, a little bit of the spiritual side and the reason why we do things like that. And you could actually see the bulb go off, and it's like, wow. And I had one FMO say to me, well, I'm going to look at fire entirely different now. I'm like, great. The more we do that, the better off we're all going to be. And I do worry a lot about climate change and how it's changing our environment, our immediate environment here. It's going to change things. Like I was just told that last winter we had the climate of St. Joseph, Missouri, which is 400 and some miles south of us. And I think about, well, all that's going to change up here on our, a lot of our woods, our plants are cold dependent too. They need that cold weather. And I worry about that. It's, how we're going to have to change our forests. We're going to have to decide which kind of trees we're going to have, and that's for that to be up to us humans is just beyond my thought, for we have to change our environment so we are going to survive. It's wow. It's like planting hickory trees here, things like that. It's going to be, man, that's going to be eye-opening. And not only that, what it's going to do in the meantime to our conifer forests, which it's already doing with the bug infestations and stuff. And we're getting bugs up here that, have never been here before. And now they're just going wild through some of our forests. So yeah, I worry about that.
I was the deputy incident commander on the Greenwood fire, and the
Oh,
fire behavior and fuels people came in, and we're in August, and they said, you should anticipate it burns like September, except that you got to go all the way through August to get to the moisture that's beyond it, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, fire was always interesting to me. It was always an interest, and I'm glad I got into it and I learned what I did, and all the great mentors I had out there. I
So,
don't know if you ever, go ahead.
no, you go ahead, Vern.
Oh, I was thinking one in particular, and I'm not even sure if he's around anymore. His name was Steve Jackala. He was from the Voyagers Park National Forest. He was the FMO there, and he was an unbelievable teacher. He took me out. We did a prescribed fire up there, and he taught me so much. And he taught me my first slop over, well, I shouldn't call it a slop over. I overachieved on the acreage, but yeah, he was very calm and rational about that. We caught it right away. Yeah, he said, now do you see why I said strips of 50 feet instead of 75 feet? And I'm like, I do now. It just built up that much energy that once it hit, got that far, went right to the canopy. And it was going up like candles all around us. And I'm like, oh my God, what did I do?
So we're winding down, and I wanted to invite Sarah and Vern to, if you want to give us sort of a 30-second, this is the other thing I forgot to tell you, kind of thing that we think is important. Sarah, if you want to go first, and that'll give Vern a chance to think about what he wants to use for his 30-second soundbite.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll just actually recommend everyone look at Vern's photography. Vern has his own book out. So I know we didn't have enough time to touch on that component of his life, but I've admired the photos that he has taken. So please look that up, and just, yeah, a general thank you again. I think all of this is really important stuff to consider and to talk. And so I'm really pleased to see Wisconsin Forestry Center and the university and DNR Forest Service come together and talk about this stuff, because I think the more we just communicate about it and share about it, it just becomes part of our language and our recognition and appreciation. So just really thank you again, Steve, and everyone, and check out Vern's photography.
Cool. Thanks, Sarah. Vern?
Well, if you want to check it out, you can go on Facebook, and I download all my photos to Facebook. It's I don't think about people stealing them and stuff. They steal them, they steal them. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for the invite here, and I hope what little knowledge I had was helpful. It's a whole new world we have to look at as far as prescribed fire, and I hope the leaders in this country realize that we need more money, we need more resources to help slow this change that's going to come over us, and to train our people. That takes time and money, and we need a lot more of that. And I think if we had a more systematic approach on how we're going to approach each state as far as using fire, that would be good. But I want to thank Sarah, Dr. Serra, and Steve. We're going to have to meet, Steve, and we're going to we should get to visit sometime, Sarah. And I appreciate all you folks' interest out there, and I appreciate you coming on the webinar today. And thank you, Susan, for your help. And that's it.
Thanks, Vern. I'm going to do my closing out housekeeping. So I'm going to show the QR code stuff. So thanks a bunch, Sarah and Vern. I loved listening to both of you and continuing on my journey of learning more about tribal ecological knowledge. And for those of you who joined us, please take a moment to evaluate today's session so that we can improve, adjust, modify how we present this and what we present in the future. You can scan the QR code or click the link in the chat. The evaluation link will be posted in the portal. Thanks for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to seeing you again on May 1st when the topic will be prescribed fire and game species. So thanks for being here, and have a good day.